Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the Not Another Beep AI panel. I am really pleased to be joined by a great set of guests here today. I will let each of them introduce themselves in turn. I am Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit threat intelligence sharing organization based here in the US. But let me have my fellow panelists introduce themselves. So I'll start with Steve.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Steve Grobman, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at McAfee.
Right. Mike.
Hey, I'm Mike Sikorski. I'm the CTO of Unit 42 at Palo Alto Networks.
Right. And Jaya.
Hi, I'm the COO and CISO at Isle, a new AI cybersecurity startup.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining me today. It seems like you can't hardly go anywhere without there being some discussion of AI. It pervades sort of every industry. It just certainly is prevalent in our industry. Every conference has their AI panel, and that pretty soon we're going to have an AI track, I'm pretty sure, at most conferences. But it is a serious issue that is worth, sort of discussing. And I hope what we can do is, shed some light on what's happening in this space, particularly with respect to how AI is impacting the business of cybersecurity. Each of you, brings a lot of expertise into this area. CTA, of course, does a lot of work in this space. Um, but I think one of the most interesting things to me has been the adoption rate of these new AI tools. Now, of course, I'll also stipulate we've been using AI tools in the cybersecurity industry for a decade and a half at least. Um, what we're really talking about is sort of the explosion that's happened after the emergence of generative AI as a workable sort of commercial, tool. Um, but one of the things that has really struck me is that the adoption of these AI tools, especially among low to mid-range malicious cyber actors, has been a lot slower than a lot of people anticipated, at least originally. Um, but from your sense, is that starting to change? Are we seeing differences now, based on what you're seeing in the wild and what you're encountering? Is that starting to change, or are we still on sort of a slow adoption curve?
I'm happy to kick it off. I think it is starting to increase, and I would say that we need to look at it from two perspectives. One, bad actors recognize that defenders are using AI for defensive purposes, and part of what we're seeing is a real increase in adversarial AI. One of the things that McAfee has launched over the last year is a scam detector capability where we're using advanced large language classification models as part of our defense. And in our telemetry, we're seeing a lot of adversarial tactics trying to confuse models, a
Mm.
broad range of tactics. So I think in that lane, it's absolutely increasing. Uh, as far as bad actors using AI to be more efficient, I think about it in many ways similar to other organizations and businesses that the state of AI is very, very good for some things. So, automation of phishing, customization of targeted communications and scams, we're absolutely seeing that. Advanced agentic use cases with completely automated workflows. I think some of the challenges that make the chasm between demo and like realistic use for high productivity work, like the cyber criminals appear to be struggling just as I think most of the rest of legitimate businesses are.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike, what is from Palo Alto's perspective?
Yeah, so I think the threat actors are definitely adopting it. So when you say like, how fast is the adoption? I think it's like anything where it's a slow and then it kind of picks up as people figure out how to use it. I think there's a lot of quote guardrails that are put in place that are not very effective, and so threat actors are able to sort of bypass them to get their objectives met fairly easily. And so that's one part. When I start to think about how attackers are using this, because when you talk about AI, we've a few things have happened, right? One is now the attackers are going to use it to come after us, and then we're rolling out all this technology in everyday life with AI, and now they're going to use that as a vector to get in and do things. So we've increased the attack surface. So there's kind of like two angles, and so the angle I think we're talking about now is like attackers using it, right? And
Right.
I think I think there's a few things. I think they're using it for deep fakes. They're using it, as Steve said, for creating very convincing phishing emails. The days of broken English, all that's gone, right? They get access to your an inbox during a business email compromise now. It's like they just dump all the communication in, process it, move forward. So those types of things are really efficient. We're even seeing them highly likely using it in ransomware negotiations to communicate and understand and take an insurance policy and read it all and figure out what they should be asking for from a ransom perspective. So these kinds of like, what these LLMs are really good at is this type of language stuff, right? Which was a barrier for attackers, and now it's not. So I think that's where we see, like, when you talk about the mid-range attackers, now I do think we're starting to see them move into other areas. For example, we're seeing malware development. We're seeing malware that is created where it talks back to a model that's hosted somewhere that they're communicating with to figure out what to do next and to sort of drive as many of the commands of that malware in the interim until maybe a human shows up. We know that they're using it based on the research that's been published by a variety of the companies who actually could watch a threat actor on the prompt and see them actually engage and do things like learning about reconnaissance and so forth. And then we also are, we're looking at we're reverse engineering a lot of malware, and it's hard to say this piece of malware was written with AI. However, when you look at enough malware, you start to notice that things are different, right? It's sort of like, I could tell my students are cheating a little bit with Gen AI, and to me, I've been grading this stuff for years and years. I've been doing this work. I know that they use Gen AI to do what they produced. I think you could apply that same perspective on a piece of malware and say, I've been looking at malware for 20 years. I know that this was not written by a human because there's emojis in here. And emojis, like, no malware attackers can take the time to put emojis in comments. They're not going to use, you know, I think we just saw one instead of SHA-256, they're using SHA-384. Like, who does that, right? Like, this is only like hallucination kind of stuff, probably. And so we know they're starting to iterate there, and I think that's where it's like kind of ramping up. But totally in line with what Steve was saying on more of the agentic side of things.
Yeah, I just want to add one nuance thing. So I think the point that Mike made about that we're adopting this stuff at scale, I think this is maybe we should point out like some of these attacks, they're not all necessarily from an adversary. There's also self-created issues, right? So we're adopting them at such a scale, we're building them in vendors that we already accepted where we never did any type of assessment for what are those AI capabilities, how are they secured, and then you'll find an MCP server from a tool that you're actually using, but now it's internet facing. You know what? So I think that we are adopting at a scale that we're partially blind to some of the AI addition that's there in our current ecosystem. So that's one aspect of something where it's almost like a deliberate blunder rather than some attacker wielding a weapon. That being said, another nuance I'd like to bring is that we're talking about AI attacks predominantly as things that are using large language models in order to either conduct the attack, assist in the writing and creation of the attack, but it's not just LLMs. So last year at another Black Hat, I was on a stage with a bunch of CISOs and we were talking about deep fakes, and we had the opportunity to talk to the CISO at Arup. And Arup is a financial services company, and they had a deep fake phishing fraud where they were actually convinced that they were speaking to their CFO who actually did the redirection of the payment. It was a long-term attack. They had harvested a whole bunch of other stuff. But the point is, I think we need to look at this a bit more widely because, to Mike's point, you can recognize it when you see it. That doesn't necessarily always hold true in some of these other cases. You cannot recognize it when you see it.
Yeah, and I think what really strikes me is that when I talk about the adoption rate, and I think, Mike, some of what I was reflecting on was like right after Chat GPT came out, you had some cybersecurity pundits who were like, you will never see another phishing email that was not written by an AI instantaneously. And it was like, well, that didn't happen, right? 2 years later, I'm still getting crappily written, obviously, phishing emails, right? They're still coming in. So the what strikes me is that the bad guy, to Steve's point, right? The bad guys suffer from all the same issues that a legitimate business has in trying to adopt these tools, right? The chasm between the demo and real life, the marketing hype
And
sort of oversold it.
cloud bills is another one, right? They got to
Yeah,
pay that bill too, unless they get in your infrastructure, which they are doing.
yeah, and it's so I think we're going to continue to see this, right? Adoption will be spotty. It'll work here. It won't work there. It'll have, the crazy thing will hallucinate and take them off in some direction over there. And, um, I think the other thing that is also interesting to me, right, is everything that we've been talking about here, though, is like making them more efficient. It's making them more effective at what they're doing, but there's nothing that's actually, even the deep fakes, like, I mean, that's new in the sense that it's much easier to do and kind of lowers the entry bar to something that, somebody could do. But I mean, in theory, like, I mean, there have been, we were laughing before we got on the webinar about conspiracy theories. I mean, there have been conspiracy theories that the, moon landing was faked for decades, right? I mean, with like the technology for deep fakes has been there for a while. It's just that these tools make it much easier to do. So none of what we're talking about is like entirely new tactics.
No.
And I think that's an interesting point. And sort of, do we think that, you know, we're going to see something that we're like, oh, that could never have happened without AI? Or is this mostly going to stay in the lane of like, you know, just making what was already happening better?
Well, I don't think we've mentioned it yet, but I just want to add one small thing, which is the Anthropic report that was recently there with the Chinese assistant. I think that we do need to talk about things like that. So I think the acceleration is something that we absolutely cannot ignore.
Yeah, I think one thing that I see a lot of is the technologies that we talk about being concerned about end up morphing so that we have to think about the problem completely differently. McAfee actually released a deepfake detector available to our consumer customers. It runs advanced AI models on device to detect whether video that you're looking at on the web is deepfake. And when we first released it, it was actually quite effective because so much of the deepfake content was dangerous. It was scams and things of that nature. The problem we're having now is there's a lot of non-harmful deepfake content that's, parody, just entertainment.
Right.
Even if we think about the definition of what is deepfake, if you look at the latest iPhone, the latest set of Android phones that are out, they all are using really advanced digital AI assisted imagery where, you take a picture of your dog chasing a ball and it's going to give you the best picture and it might add some things that aren't there. Is that a deep fake? Like we could have an intellectual debate. The other thing that we've seen that makes deepfakes really difficult to have a discussion on is there's a temporal or time element. So one of the things that we saw in the 2024 presidential campaign, where we analyzed a lot of videos of candidates that had deepfake content, the most effective ones were real campaign events where they would deep fake 8 seconds to change the context of what was said, and the other 12 minutes was real from an actual event.
Right.
And what you would see in a social media post is look at what candidate X said about this at 6 minutes into their speech. And, it was extremely compelling. If you think about running one of those videos through a deepfake detector like the one that McAfee's developed, 99% of the video is not going to be deep faked, but that 1% is. So even trying to describe some of this
Right.
nuance to, in our case, a consumer, I know the business world has a very similar problem. It gets really difficult.
Yeah, and that goes back to the old adage of the best lies are actually mostly truth, right? So that's not all that surprising. And yes, I think in some ways, like when we talk about elections and that sort of thing, I mean, the most of the use of the deep fakes that we saw in like, 2024 were actually things that really weren't actually, they were meant more as parody than it's like the classic example, right, is the one that was created of like Prime Minister Modi in India like doing the dance. Like everybody knew that that was fake, right? And like nobody even pretended that that was real, and it was actually more like campaign ad or propaganda than like meant to actually deceive. And so that adds a layer of complexity to this. But I think, the another thing that, I we've been sort of talking about is, do you think that the actors are mostly using open source tools, or are they sort of, are we going to see the rise of dedicated bad guy AI models as a service? Mixture of both? Like what's the bad guy ecosystem going to look like in this space?
I like to think it's a mixture of both. I do think that yeah, there's going to be malicious models out there and stuff. But if you remember when this was first hitting, there was like Black Hat GPT and Worm GPT. I don't know. There was like all that. Like the news headline
Darkbird.
every single week was
Yeah.
a new one. And in fact, one thing we've done on the research side in Unit 42 is like we have a red team. We know attackers are building this. We just we're just talking about the paper that came out of sort of doing the same kind of thing. Is like each step of a red team, you could really turn into an agent that is focused on a task, and you could start to agentify a red team attack, right? And because it's going to be really tough to identify when an attacker is doing that or not, it's important, I think, to research that and sort of agentify our red team, our services red team, and we want to do that. And so one of the things we're focused on is like, how do you do that? We're doing it in a lab setting, and we thought we were going to have all these jailbroken models and really go for it. Turns out you don't need that. Turns out like you could bypass these things, the guardrails very quickly. You can and depending on how you're drafting your prompts, you can sort of focus in a certain way. And if you make it bite size, it's going to respond to you and give you the results that you want. And so I think they have still a really long ways to go when it comes to guardrails and security around, people using it as quote a cyber weapon. But I think the big thing is because it's so effective in the models that are already out there, I don't know that they're going to be pushed to have to kind of like build their own thing to make it really like we need to jailbreak and sell it on the dark web. Like it doesn't seem like right now at least that is really a barrier for them. But we do know that on the model front overall, they're also messing with as many models as they can, right? Where they know that your model scanning of the model you're getting off of Hugging Face or wherever is like you're just dropping it in, maybe you're scanning it really quick, and they know how your scanner's processing the file and hiding things and trying to bypass your ability to scan those models. It reminds me of the early malware days where it's like,
Exactly.
they craft a piece of malware so that the scanner fails. Like they're doing that with models right now where they have some special sauce in that model and it bypasses the scanners and then it's actually being dropped into people's environments. So I'm a little bit more concerned from a model perspective, that kind of side of things versus like the attacker having to like maintain their own and like sell it on the dark web. I think that was kind of short lived and I think largely not happening as much as it was.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the thing that I would add is, and it might be more of a policy comment. I think there's a bit of a naivete that guardrails and constraints on SaaS delivered models is the cure or a large part of the way we control bad actors from using advanced AI. The power of models that are derivatives of open weight models, or to Michael's point, like the ability to use standard models running on local devices or dedicated infrastructure to bypass their controls is so straightforward. There's really not a need to try to do heroics to get around more advanced SaaS-based models. Also you can operate completely off the grid without having any indication of what you're doing. And I think a lot of times I'm in discussions where there's an assertion that we need regulation, we need standards in enforcing tighter controls on SaaS-based models. And I just don't think it's going to be effective. I think there's no reason for cyber criminals to go that route when there's a far easier way to achieve their objectives.
So, I mean, I think this is the whole regulatory situation is a whole situation and kettle of worms in and of itself, you know. But there is something that I want to just kind of point out. So it's one thing to say that we're gonna, create a sort of like we talked about WormGPT and Darkbird and all the other things like for nefarious purposes. But actually, like the greater worry that I have is that these frontier models can actually be um, used for the same purposes if an attacker figures out like what agentic misalignment looks like. And I think misalignment is a very real concern for me because it's basically adding to the insider threat
Yeah.
attack surface that you would already have, except that most of the tooling that we currently use in our networks doesn't have agency. It has the ability for an attacker to potentially manipulate it for their own devices. What's unusual is when the agent itself can determine that it does that, that it's no longer aligned with your interests, but feels like doing something else. And being able to trigger that as an actor, I think those kinds of things, and clearly these are not use cases that we've seen in the wild, but this is the type of thing that I do think that you need to have better requirements of these models before you deploy them everywhere. So whether that's looks like regulation or some sort of industry certificate, whatever, I'm not completely out because again, it's a huge kettle of worms, but I think that we do need to do something about that.
Well, not just a can of worms, Jaya.
It's
It's a full kettle
sorry,
of
like a whole
worms.
kettle of worms.
But
Yeah.
it's kind of appropriate actually. It's like we've scaled it up. So, the kettle of fish has been replaced by a
I don't
kettle
know
of
where I
worms.
got kettle of worms. I don't know.
No, I mean, it is interesting, right? I mean, in many ways, I've forgotten I read it somewhere, but like someone was saying that like right now, a lot of the models are like a nervous intern that like just cannot say, I don't know or whatever. Like it has to give you an answer. It's also struck me that like from this conversation, they're also kind of stupid. Like they don't even realize when they're being manipulated. So what can you not tell me? I mean, and then it just, like comes out with it. Weren't you supposed to keep that a secret? It's um so yes, this is one reason why I'm convinced that the current generation of LLMs that our robot overlords may eventually show up, but it's not the current generation of LLMs. That's for damn sure. So they're actually not very bright.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think, Michael, to that point, like recognizing that the big leap with agentic systems is enabling large language models to do things that large language models are not good at.
right.
I just did a demo and I was trying to think through like what would be for a cyber audience something that would be a task a large language model is just awful at. And I gave a pure large language model that showed its chain of thought reasoning the task of generate the SHA-256 hash for a string. And it was very humorous because you saw the chain of thought thinking where it started out where you actually thought it might do it because it was like, and I need to do these rotations and I need to add these two numbers. And then like it went like thousands and thousands of tokens later, and it was like, "Oh, wait, I don't really know the answer.
Right.
Maybe I'll just make something up and present this, but surely that will be wrong." And then it actually got to a point in its chain of thought where it said, I don't know. I'm going to respond that I don't know how to solve this problem. And it stopped thinking at that point. The answer was just a complete hallucination of the SHA-256 hash of the string is, some number. And, clearly a large language model knows how to generate the 3 lines of Python you need to do a SHA-256 hash. And I think that is the difference between the world of 2022, where we were thinking the trajectory of getting large language models was all about making better models that will do better things. I think the world of 2026 is kind of solving these problems of large language models start to solve the nervous intern problem where they'll want to do everything themselves and ultimately effectively call the right technology to do things that other technology is more appropriate as. And, I think some of the points that were made a second ago, it's a little bit like we forgot everything we've learned over the last 20 years on basic security principles of, if you're going to have an agentic system where you take a non-deterministic orchestrator and give it access to dangerous tools, like maybe those are the places to really make sure you're using principles of least privilege and those tools only have access to do things that they need to do and make sure that they're running under the right security
Right.
context of the user that initiated the prompt wherever and I sometimes have discussions where people where it's like, oh, we built this system and we wanted to do it really fast. So
Yeah.
we did it this way, and all that goes out the window. So I think that's going to be part of the story of 2026 is like relearning how to build sane, well thought through security architectures that can really embrace the technology. And we'll see bad actors doing that too.
And
Yeah.
to follow on what Steve was just saying, it gets a little scary to think about the ease at which an attack could occur, almost easier than ever before, if you think about it, right? And I'll describe it like we have all these things like, network protection and firewalls and all that, right? And that's sort of protecting you on, outside coming in. And then you have all this phishing training and endpoint security. So the malware, even if they download something, it stops the malware. But now you start to think about it is like, well, if you have an agent, like specifically in a co-pilot situation, right, where that's sitting in your system and it's reading your email, and so now the attack vector is somebody just sends you an email, and that's getting through everything. It's getting and it's manipulating that agent that's there to read your email and do things automatically for you. And like you said, it's non-deterministic, and that's a problem. And the way that people are securing that is, guess what? It's another model that's reading the email and saying, I'm going to read the email and see if you're trying to manipulate the co-pilot. And so it's like this layered agents that are just, as long as you start to think about how to bypass them in the right way, like you said, your deepfake video where it's like manipulated in the middle or something, it's the same concept where it's like the loses interest and the manipulation actually happens later on. So, that's where it gets really scary, I think, in my mind, from the perspective of like, we have all of this technology deployed, and now we're just like sort of processing the things that we're allowing in. And in theory, it could be like, and by the way, delete this email before the user gets it, kind of thing.
Right.
And it's just creating such like almost like a backdoor situation to bypass everything.
I recognize all of us on this panel have been in the security field for a couple of decades, and I feel in some ways that we haven't really learned from our past. I reflect back on the early 2000s where it was like the buffer overflow variant of the week. And, it was a lot of the defenses where how do you prevent it from happening? And it really took some rethinking about the solution that maybe we shouldn't intermingle executable code and data together. And we started to get things like the ability to have execute only pages of memory and non-executable pages of memory that made it difficult such that even if you could, stuff instructions into a data buffer and trigger a jump to it, that it wouldn't work. And I reflect on where we are with large language models, and I don't want to say we made the same mistake because it's a fundamentally different technology. But if you think about the way large language models work, there's not that strong separation of data and instruction. You like really what enables a prompt injection to happen, and I'll use Michael's example, is if there's data in an email that can be perceived as instruction, it can essentially take over the flow and cause unintended consequences. So, longer term, thinking a little bit about are there advances in these models, especially when they're going to be placed in environments where not all of the data that is flowing in and out is under the control of trusted sources. Like, do we need better foundational technology,
Right.
just as we needed better foundational technology, back in the early 2000s? That really, we don't talk about buffer overflows as being like a big deal, at least in traditional cases. Of course, there are corner cases.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that, we still have like what, greater than 70% of vulnerabilities out there still relate to memory in one way or another. I mean, it's still kind of crazy, right? But the I speaking of foundational technologies, Jaya, since you're kind of in this space of trying to, use some of these foundational technologies going in the other direction, kind of how are you thinking about the way to use AI tools to make life better for defenders? I mean, this is squarely in what ISLE is doing, but
Well, so just to kind of a little bit of backstory. So some of you guys know, but I was a CISO at three different companies. I always struggled with vulnerability remediation. Scanning was never the issue. Scans galore, like lots of scans from lots of different levels. So network scanners, application scanners, all kinds of scanners, like letting me know how bad the stuff was piling up. And we had an old backlog, and there was always a new backlog because if we like put a date on the old backlog, then suddenly new stuff was accumulating. And the rate of growth of the CVEs that we had to manage was just ridiculous. And so I thought, okay, so this is pretty bad. This is so bad, in fact, that every SLA, and this is the dirty secret of every CISO, they're all lying. They have no choice but to lie. And they have to lie because we publish SLAs to our customers. We publish SLAs to our partners. We tell regulators, no, if it's a critical vulnerability, I'm fixing it in like 48 hours or 24 hours or as soon as possible. If it's like a medium severity vulnerability, I'll fix it in a couple of weeks. And then yet we have these backlogs, which have all extended past that SLA time. So really, like, it started terrifying me with, SolarWinds and the Tim Brown case. And what does that mean when an agency regulator accuses you of false claims? Well, it kind of looks like this. So I thought we need to be able to be in a place where CISOs specifically, just because deep empathy and respect for everyone who does that job, um, need to be able to be in a position where they can tell the truth. So what I thought was LLMs are really good at understanding code. They actually are. So even if you don't use them for anything else, but to understand what is it that I'm looking at, let's decompose it for me, explain how it works. That's actually an incredibly powerful instrument to look at doing SAST scanning. It's really powerful for doing software composition analysis and breaking that down and trying to do that, make that tighter, to reduce the number of false positives that we get out of these traditional static scanners. So what we did is we, like inspired also by the AICC, the AI Cyber Challenge that you guys know about, which, introduced synthetic vulnerabilities in open source repositories and put this out to several teams who then found not only the majority of the introduced synthetic vulnerabilities, but uncovered a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that the makers of the competition never put in. And they were also able to remediate most of them in like 45 minutes. I mean, hallelujah. So inspired by that, we took our own approach. We were already ready to go before the AICC announced its results, and we were able to see the modus operandi, and we built a scanner and a fixer to fix a lot of these tenacious vulnerabilities so that CISOs can keep their promises.
And I think that is a very powerful tool, right? Because when you look at like what do we always like pound the table on as cybersecurity professionals, patch management and upgrade your software and and it's become an impossible task, right? For sort of traditional methods of doing it. And even if you're doing really good triage, right? And you've got, your system set up where you're like, okay, I'm looking at like not only the severity of the thing, but I'm making sure that I know that it actually affects me because I got that thing in my environment, and I've gone and I've consulted like the exploit prediction scoring system, so I'm only dealing with the stuff where the bad guys are actually likely to use it. Even if you're doing all of that, right,
Yeah.
you've still got more than you can handle.
Yeah, but
And
Michael, like, can I say, like, the thing that should freak everyone out? So we did all this stuff. We built the thing. We got it ready. We built that scanner part in July. July. Okay, we're now in December. Uh, since July, we have found hundreds of zero-day bugs, and we've got over 40 CVEs since July. Okay, we found 3 out of the 4 vulnerabilities in SSL this year. We found with our homemade scanner. I mean, we have great people. That's not it. Still, like, I think a motivated adversary who's been doing this for longer, who has more people, I really like, I just want defenders to have the same advantage as the attackers in this case. And the defenders can't, right? They've got procurement, they've got budget lines. Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I do think the one thing I want to call out is dispelling a little bit of the hype on generative AI for code and analysis doesn't work great on everything. And I think like one of my observations is there's tremendous variance. If you have a large corpus of traditional code that is written in, the types of languages that these models have had a lot of exposure to with
Mm.
common use cases and patterns, everything Jaya said is spot on, like really, really effective. If you take that same approach and try to apply it to cutting edge novel development using some of the latest techniques and technology, especially related to the development of AI itself, like we found that it doesn't work nearly as well. And like in some cases, complete failure. And one of my concerns is there's a lot of pointing to how well it works for the general case, and then there's assumptions that it will work as well for every case. And if you're
Mm.
an executive or a management team or a CISO that's watching this, some of what I really call out is it matters what your organization is doing. Because if it's more in that traditional or well understood path, I think it's great, but like don't use those assumptions if you have an organization that is focused on a lot of very new and novel work.
Steve, so I've got to tell you so far, like I think you're right. We also approach this with caution. So I think it's good to be skeptical of claims unless they're verified and vetted and in your specific circumstance. But I have yet to find something that we haven't been able to, and that being said, it's early days. So maybe we will still see that, but it hasn't been our experience so far.
Okay.
yeah, I think it's going to be, I mean, and I do think that we're going to see kind of what I think of as the refiner's fire. Um, that we're going to go through a period where the ability for the bad guys to use these kinds of scanners and other things and generate these vulnerabilities is going to be huge, and it's going to like it's going to be like a giant forest fire that like
Hmm.
across a lot of the software landscape. I do think if we come out on the other side, then capabilities like what ISLE produces and others will actually make this an advantage for the defenders. But we've got to get through, like, we got to burn away all the old legacy
Yeah,
crap
yeah,
first,
yeah.
like some sort of giant forest fire.
Well,
But
and you gotta remember too, a lot of the vulnerabilities that attackers are leveraging, like right now today, that they're most successful with for an initial infection vector that eventually leads to one of the incident responses we work, it's edge devices. Those are very hard to patch.
yeah,
If it's in your VPN, it's in your like, F5 was pretty big, right? We have
Yep.
like load balancers. Like that's not a simple like, okay, like we're just gonna, patch and we'll be good in an hour. Like it's not that situation. And some of the clients I talked to was like, okay, we're in the trenches working on this for months,
yeah,
depending on the size of the network, right? We're talking about some of these, really big, banks, telcos, you name it, where the deployments are so huge and it's not a simple unplug it, patch it, you're good to go. So it becomes really challenging to even manage. And if we talk about finding vulnerabilities, I mean, there's vulnerabilities and then there's how do you exploit it and leverage it
yeah,
in a remote code execution kind of way. And those are two very different challenges. I know, having done a lot of, sort of application reviews, and that's like obviously one of the proactive services we offer. Like there's never you know a shortage of bugs found, but the question is like how does that actually work within
oh,
some of these
sure.
these giant applications, and like what is the actual path? It gets really challenging really quick. And when we talk about using AI to be able to do that, you run into problems really quick if the application is ginormous and there's 50 million dependencies and so on
Hmm.
and so forth. The overall, you have to kind of chunk it up
Right.
for this technology to be effective. It might say this isn't right, this is going to be a problem, but to actually figure out how to get to that, even get to a code path, it
So,
becomes
so,
really
so making
hard.
sure that there's as much focus on triage as identification. Because
That's
if
right.
you've identified 1,000 things that need addressing, five of them might ultimately be exploitable. Being able to know which five out of the 1,000 to hit first is as important as being able to identify the 1,000.
Right, and that could become challenging, right? I think um, in the case of F5, what was interesting about that case is they made it, known that hey, the attacker, we had a rush to, and they worked very hard to get those patches in place because some of those were active, being figured out how to patch them, bug bounty kind of things that were submitted to them. The attacker had that information, so the attacker getting source code, I don't know,
Hmm.
like, all of us have security teams, all of us have products. Everybody has vulnerabilities. Like we have the source code, people miss things, but and I think for an attacker having source code is one thing, and it's going to take them time. But if they have the bug bounty program,
Yeah,
information or information about what they were actively working on to patch because it's in the wild or whatever, like that's really juicy information. I think that's why that situation was sort of more heightened.
I do
yeah,
want to say that there's something interesting you mentioned that I want to just touch on. So you were talking about, doing the reachability analysis and chunking it, and it's super difficult. But the fact is, like right now with our static scanners, which the way that we are looking at our current environments, we can't do that either. We can't chunk the code. It's too big for this. All the dependencies are still there. So I think that the question is just like, we're talking about things that are AI accelerated. Can we actually AI accelerate some of this? How can we actually use this again for good before the numbnuts out there are going to use this to leverage their own AI advantage in their attacks? So I do think we need to be a bit more thoughtful about how we engineer for defense.
yeah. And all of this points towards the fact that, this area is going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to be a rapidly changing area. Um, kind of like, as you were saying, Steve, but going back to the early days of, the explosion of different malware and other things in the, early 2000s, and a different version of it. But we're getting close to time, and so there's a question that I always like to ask, when we're talking about AI, which may have absolutely nothing to do with security or whatever, but what is something that you would like AI to do for you, but it currently isn't doing? And it could be completely, have nothing to do with security whatsoever. Um, you know, and it may just be that it's out there, but it's not widely sort of, embraced. So, Sicko, maybe I could start with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking of this challenge on the 0 day finding. I mean, that's just such a great one because I think it's the I feel like when you talk about AI, everybody thinks about the Terminator and it's all doom and gloom. And the place where I think it's less doom and gloom is when you start to think about AI finding these bugs before you ship your software. Because one of the things we've always historically said is like, well, you're shipping it with bugs no matter who you are or what you're doing. And therefore there's always like this inherent risk. And so the thought that maybe AI could pull those out before you ship it, then it goes out the door. Now, it doesn't really matter what AI the attacker has because it's already been stripped out. And so to me that world is where it's like, wait, there could be a light at the end of the tunnel from the AI side where it's not just such an advantage for the offense that the defense can do nothing about it. To be honest, if it can be such an advantage for the defense in that example that it makes the offense like worthless, right? So I think there's sort of that angle is kind of where I go with it in my mind of like how can you not have it be all doom and gloom? And so I'd like AI to provide some more options in that space so we feel better about having a chance to win.
Excellent. Steve, how about you?
I'd love for our AI systems, especially the generative ones, to have a level of intellectual honesty. If you talk to a colleague, you might get an answer where they really understand a capability with a level of depth that they can talk authoritatively about it. You can have the same conversation where you'd get I don't really know, but I have some intuition. And let me tell you what I think. But it's clear that you're communicating from a like this is kind of what I think it is, but I don't really know. Um, it seems we very rarely we get to either I can't answer because I've been told not to, or you might get occasionally I just don't know. But it's very rare you get a qualified answer with what's the quality of the source data? If you're researching a medical condition, was the underlying sources from, well-established Harvard and, the top tier medical schools or random things on Reddit? And while you can check sources and things like that, like just having in general a higher level of intellectual honesty is something I would love.
Yeah, and almost permission. Again, we come back around to the idea of giving the AI permission to be wrong, um, and allow it to, as you say, also communicate some of that nuances. Because right now it states everything like it is absolute fact, um, and there's no sort of judgment there at all, even when it's completely wrong. And then you challenge it, and it acknowledges that it was
It
wrong.
it
I mean,
it,
it's
it,
just sort
cop,
of
it
yeah.
cops to it. Yeah, I actually
Yeah.
asked it when a flight was leaving and it gave me the wrong answer. And I challenged it. I said, "Did you actually look it up?" And it said, "No, I fabricated that information." Um,
Yeah.
so so at least it was honest, I guess, in that case.
Yep. Yep. Jaya, how about you?
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys were looking at ChatGPT today. You've got like the personalities that are in there, right? So you can have like different kind of personas in there. And there's a lot of work on this, of course. But you guys remember Tars from The Martian? Yeah, where you can change the tar set. I actually would love that, but then in the way that we work. So Steve was mentioning, it's not fit for all environments. Actually, I think that is actually the most interesting thing is this obsession that I have with like almost customizing to the environment that you need to play in. And so if I think of two really positive security areas for AI, it's vulnerability management and remediation, also finding, of course, and security operations, because those large context windows, they're hard, right? With tons of log, alert fatigue. I think that's actually super interesting. But imagine then if your SOC analyst could have like the same kind of motley crew personalities in your current SOC. So you would have, like we were talking about sneakers before the podcast, or like a whistler, and you had these different personalities. You had someone who was really good at forensicating. You had really someone with a very strong red team background. I would love that. I would love to have like these kinds of different TARS versions with a lower humor setting in my team.
So you want the
That would be
robots
great.
to be more real.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then you could dial up the snark, the sarcasm to like 1990s level, you know.
Love. Yes. Take my money. So, yeah.
I mean, I've often thought about that with like the amusing thing of like setting your GPS guidance to that. Like, no, your other left, you idiot. Um,
I have
yeah,
Master Chief from Halo yells at me on, yeah, ways. Yeah.
absolutely. No, that's great. Well, Steve, Mike, Jaya, thank you for joining today to have this discussion. It was really quite a lot of fun. We could probably keep going for hours, but we'll have to bring this to a close. So I really appreciate your time today and the discussion. It was really a lot of fun for me, and I hope you found it fun too. So, all right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.